On this episode of Newt's World, the United States is now embroiled with a brutal and autocratic communist China in a new Cold War and a second, far more consequential race to the moon. Whichever country seizes the commanding heights of the moon will have preferential access to vast lunar resources that will determine the quality of life on Earth and the political and moral character of humans as we advance into the solar system. The United States should win Space Race 2.0 and is leading an international and commercial coalition to do so. Yet, Communist China is giving no ground, even as its rockets soar above us. The clear risk: timid and visionless policymakers in the White House and Congress may well surrender the ultimate high ground to Beijing. Here to discuss his new book, Red Moon Rising: How America Will Beat China on the Final Frontier, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, author Dr. Greg Autry. He is the Director of Space Leadership, Policy and Business in the Thunderbird School of Global Management and a professor at Arizona State University. Dr. Autry served on the NASA Agency Review Team and as White House liaison at NASA. He co-authored Red Moon Rising with Peter Navarro. Greg, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you, Newt. I can't be more excited than to have the opportunity to spend a good deal of time talking with you, which is always informative.
But why don't you start with why this is so important? I think to the average American, looking at all the other problems we have, it's kind of like the space race is interesting, but tell us, why is it vital to our future?
That's a good question, and frankly, the main reason we wrote the book. Peter and I opened the introduction saying, why spend money in space when there's problems right here on Earth, which you constantly hear? I think you know the answer, but I'm going to share with the listeners. It's that no major problem in all of human history has ever been solved from inside the box. It's external resources thinkings and opportunities that allow for the growth that lets you get out of the dilemmas that you face, whether those are economic, environmental, social, or political. And many of the problems that we face here in the United States and globally, I believe, are because we don't have that frontier. We don't have that economic frontier. We don't have that place to send people who aggressively want to explore and exploit new resources. That is a fundamental human driver. On a more practical level, from the U.S. standpoint, it's a matter of national prestige. We talk quite a bit in the book about how the fall of the Soviet Union was probably precipitated in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when they fell behind in the space race and we took the moon. The credibility of communism globally took a huge hit when they failed to match Kennedy's challenge to get to the moon. And America from that point on was just clearly recognized as the technological capable leader. And then we talk in the book about all the benefits that are going to come to us. There are incredible opportunities for new materials, for new medical treatments, for new clean sources of power that will be returned to Earth and make the Earth a much better place to live, even if you're not going to space.
In that context, with space being that important, how do you analyze and assess the Chinese communist effort in space?
Well, to their credit, it's a very serious effort, Newt. One of the things that I have to say impresses me about them is they say what they're going to do, and then they do it, and they do it almost on time every time. They haven't been nearly as creative as us, and to be perfectly honest, most of their technology is either stolen from the U.S. or bought directly from the Russians. There's nothing super new going on, but they've been executing admirably and doing things that, frankly, we've even had some issues with. So they've got landers on the moon. And as you might have noticed, a lot of countries and several U.S. companies have been attempting that, and none of them have had a perfect success. The Chinese have done a sample return mission from the moon, and another one just launched on Friday. This is something that we're trying to do for Mars, but we haven't gotten together. So they're serious. On the military front, they are very serious, and they intend to use the high ground, the ultimate high ground, as a tool against us because they have seen how effective space dominance has been for the United States in the late 20th and early 21st century.
Just as an aside, you mentioned Russia. I mean, Russia at one point was a major competitor, but I get the sense that they just financially have not been able to sustain beyond near space where they have a military focus. But when you think about going beyond that, It seems to me that the Russians have sort of dropped out of the game. Is that your assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a shame. I mean, again, although I didn't admire the Soviet Union, what they accomplished deserved kudos when you look at what they did in the 1950s and 60s and then putting up the first space stations in the 70s. These were real accomplishments. But then they fell into a maintenance period where essentially the best that they could do was keep flying Soyuz with a lot of American subsidies. Most people don't realize how much NASA subsidized the Russian space program from the 90s through the 2000s. And then they didn't invest themselves. And they had bad leadership with Dmitry Rogozin, Putin's apparatchik, who ran Roscosmos, and it's gone into total decline. There's been a brain drain. Russian scientists are trying to get the heck out of there because they don't want to be handed an AK-47 and sent to the front in Ukraine. It's a sad situation.
Was it a mistake for us to rely on Soyuz in the 90s?
Well, when you had the opening up there with Gorbachev and then the post-Gorbachev period where we thought Yeltsin was going to be helpful, you can probably speak to it better than I can. In my opinion, we should have done everything we could to engage with them and keep them in the fold of democratic Western thinking and help them progress on the path that they seem to be on. But the moment we saw backsliding there, we should have been realistic. But at no point should we ever become dependent on any foreign system, even if they're our best friends. And so it was a huge mistake not to move commercial launch sooner. But to the credit of both the G.W. Bush administration and the Obama administration, they frankly finally got commercial going, and they deserve credit for that too. Trump expanded it enormously. It would have been great if it happened back when you were talking about it 10 or 20 years before it did.
It's very ironic. Bob Walker and I, Bob was ultimately chairman of the Science and Technology Committee. In the late 80s, we actually, as you know, passed an amendment and got $400 million for NASA to build a reusable rocket, which they promptly hired Lockheed Martin, who promptly failed. And then they gave up. And along comes Elon Musk 10, 15 years later, and he has the persistence to recognize that this is just an engineering problem, and that you can work your way through it. He sort of revolutionized space both in cost. It's the most deflationary single development that we've seen in terms of the collapse of the price of getting a pound into orbit. If he succeeds, as I suspect he will eventually, in building a genuine starship that has 33 engines, the fact that it's reusable, the effect of that on getting both weight and people into space should be pretty enormous. In your judgment, is there anything comparable being developed in China?
Well, being the Chinese, guess what? They promised to copy it all. So they've got CGI demonstrations of vehicles that they claim they're going to build that look, guess what? Exactly like Starship, just as they've released pictures of vehicles that look exactly like the Falcon 9. But to your point, a really important thing, I covered that history in the book. There were several attempts in the 1980s and 90s for private launch companies to get going. And unfortunately, besides you and Bob and a few voices in the woods, there wasn't a lot of support. And NASA often was more obstructive to those attempts than embracing. I'm glad to see that change now. On the reusability standpoint, it's also super important to note that SpaceX has never actually yet returned the savings they get from reusability to customer price. Their customer price for launch hit $62 million, which was the low point before they started doing reusability. And that was because Elon is also a master at lowering the production cost of things. He's a manufacturing production engineer, really. And what he's done is brought the cost of making rockets down by bringing in automotive people and using off-the-shelf parts instead of the bespoke, super custom method that rockets used previously. And that lowered the cost more than anything. There's still another drop ready to come. And when you have a technology where the basic driver for the technology is increasing in performance and decreasing in price every year, you have a Moore's law like we did back with computing in the 1980s and 90s. And that promises an incredible boom because the applications, the things that you can do with that we don't know yet are about to explode. And I think we're all going to be amazed.
What will the impact be on people going into space?
Well, first of all, there'll be a lot more of them. So up until now, there's been about 600 people in space, but just in the last couple of years, that's begun to change rapidly. SpaceX has flown more people to space in the last 4 years than China has since they started their human spaceflight program back in 2003. So SpaceX in 4 years versus the government of China in 20 years. That's incredible. I believe we're going to get to the point, hopefully, where you and I are going to have the opportunity to finally go at a reasonable price as an experience. But people are also going to go up there to start working and living and getting the benefits of it. And I think in the next 10 to 20 years, there'll be more people living in space than have flown in space so far.
You keep hearing that there are things you can do with zero gravity and with very low gravity that create all sorts of new openings, but they haven't really materialized as commercial possibilities at this stage.
Interestingly, I chair the Business Case Review Committee for a NASA program called INSPA, In-Space Production Applications. And we evaluate manufacturing proposals to go to the International Space Station. These are high TRL level experiments where the technology is proven, and we're looking to see if there's a business case. And I have to say, Newt, we're finally getting there. A company called Flawless Photonics, who makes a fiber optic cable called Z-Blan at a quality that can only be made in space, has produced 5 kilometers of usable cable in their last run. Several of the individual pieces were more than 1 kilometer long. This material sells for hundreds or maybe $1,000 per meter, weighs very, very little. So it's actually a practical in-space manufacturing application. Why do people want better fiber optic cable? Because with less occlusions and imperfections inside the cable, you get much more better data transmission, and you can maybe get a few microseconds faster between London and New York and execute a trade worth billions of dollars. So this is actually a real game changer.
Wow, that's a great example. When you look at the Chinese side, how big a challenge should we face in terms of if the Chinese do end up dominating in space?
Wow. Well, whoever holds the high ground controls the territory underneath it, Newt. And frankly, I testified to the House Natural Resources Committee in December and was asked that question. And I said it was an existential threat to the United States and to the values of the Enlightenment and Western civilization. If the Chinese own the moon and they own low Earth orbit, they can do what they want with the planet. And that is terrifying when you consider who their leadership is at this moment.
One of the things, as you know, that I've been very concerned about, testified about, and wrote about is electromagnetic pulse. It's been very challenging to try to get the system to understand how real this danger is and how plausible it is. Could you talk just for a second about your concerns about the Chinese potential with electromagnetic pulse to literally wipe out whole layers of communications and intelligence satellites?
Great question, Newt. In fact, Peter and I opened the book with that scenario because we think it's so important people understand. So an electromagnetic pulse is capable of basically disabling and, depending on the strength, completely destroying the technology that drives our everyday lives by sending out a wave of highly ionized atoms that will destroy the chips inside your cell phone, the chips that drive your car, your refrigerator, and even, frankly, destroy the electrical grid itself by overloading the transformers that are critical to the distribution of electricity. So what will happen is nothing will work. But worse than that, Newt, is nothing's going to get fixed for several reasons. One, there's no vehicles capable of driving anymore. Your electric car in your garage will probably burst into a ball of flames. The non-electric cars all have electronic ignition systems and computer controls. They're all bricks. Every highway will be jammed with dead cars and no vehicles capable of towing them out of there. Plus, guess what? All our electrical transformers are dead and all of our electronics are dead. And we have become nearly 100% dependent on China to supply us those things. We can't replace them. The Chinese are not going to be loading up boatloads of supplies for us. We are going to be instantly transported into the Stone Age. And as we kind of sarcastically say in the book, the Gen Z folks are going to have to learn how to build a fire and sharpen a spear without a mansplainer on YouTube to show them how. That's a terrifying day.
That kind of world would, in fact, face the kind of collapse that people warned about with the population bomb. I mean, if you took away all the advantages of high civilization, the carrying capacity of North America is probably 3 or 4 million people.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly if you return to small lot organic farming, like my crazy liberal friends think that they want to have, you're back in the Middle Ages. And no, you don't have that carrying capacity. You can't have 6 billion people. Frankly, I think there's a strange group of people who would like to see half of the world or 3/4 of us starve to death, but that's where you would go in no time. The other thing from a policy standpoint that worries me about EMPs, Newt, is both the Russians and the Chinese have categorically stated that even though EMPs are usually a nuclear-based weapon technology, that they do not consider them to be strategic nuclear weapons, but rather to be cyber weapons, and therefore usable on the battlefield. And worse, the fact is the Chinese are attacking us with cyber attacks every single day in the United States. They hack the United States government in a multitude of ways. And so they consider cyber attacks legitimate. So there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't use one of these to achieve their goals.
I agree. And I think we have to profoundly rethink our whole strategic posture and recognize it's a society on society competition. But let me go. I grew up when science fiction was exciting and positive and people like Asimov and Heinlein and others. I want to go to one of the most fascinating examples, which is a little bit nutty, but nonetheless plausible. And that is the asteroid Psyche, which is estimated to have $10 quintillion of minerals, which is 600,000 times the annual economic activity of the U.S. So here's my question. We have identified this source. It is outside our normal concern about mining. If you were designing a strategy to exploit Psyche, would you want to develop more effective barges to go back and forth, or would you want to try to figure out a way to actually bring Psyche closer to Earth?
Wow, that is also an excellent question. So Psyche is particularly fairly big. There are a lot of other smaller targets that would probably be more movable, but moving a metallic asteroid closer to the Earth might be the best way to exploit those materials and mine them so that the actual transportation doesn't have to occur over and over and over. One of the things we really need, though, to achieve things of that goal, whether it's transporting the loads of ore or transporting the whole asteroid, is nuclear space propulsion. And that's something that we actually worked on in the 1960s and had ready to go. Frankly, we could have been on Mars in the 1980s if we hadn't dropped that. The Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville is capable of ramping those programs back up, and there's been some interest. So that's the top thing we need to do to make that happen.
I thought I saw that NASA was actually working now to develop a nuclear rocket force in space. Not to get to space, but once you're there.
Exactly. To be clear, nuclear launch is possible, but not necessarily as attractive for a variety of environmental issues. But in space, yeah, absolutely. And they have reinvestigated that. I have to give credits to Bahavi Alal at NASA, who pushed for that program for both nuclear propulsion and nuclear power on the surface of the moon. But we need to do that. And a lot of that has potential to feed back to benefits here on Earth because, frankly, again, if we continued with nuclear in the 70s, we wouldn't be talking about carbon emissions or climate change or even worry about proximate particulate pollution in our cities. We'd be living clean, free, with cheap energy and higher standards of living.
Now, beyond moving asteroids closer to Earth, we actually have a huge satellite called the Moon. And the head of China's lunar program said that the Moon is so rich in helium-3 that it could solve humanity's energy problems for at least 10,000 years. Can you walk us through that? I will confess most of us are not very knowledgeable about helium-3.
Yeah, so what can you get on the Moon? First of all, every time you look up there, you see a crater, and many of those craters are metallic asteroids, and the cores of those craters may still be there, or the material that was delivered in the core is mixed into the regolith, so you can mine that. But there's an isotope of helium. Normally, a helium atom has 2 protons and 2 neutrons, but if it only has 2 protons and 1 neutron, which is extremely rare. It is attractive for use in nuclear fusion reactors, which give us, again, fairly unlimited clean free energy without any of the waste products or attendant secondary radiation that you get from a fission reactor. So that's kind of the ultimate dream for clean energy. We don't know whether it works or not because there's not enough helium-3 on the Earth. It's almost non-existent. It's like 4 parts per billion or something extracted from natural gas. But on the moon, we believe it exists in fairly abundant quantities relatively because the solar wind has been pushing helium into the moon's regolith for a long, long time. So we believe we can find it there. In fact, the Chinese insist that they have with their last lander and that we can bring it back to Earth. And basically, the equivalent of 1 space shuttle payload could power the United States for months.
You talked about energy. You also talked, I think, in a very interesting way about the opportunities in biology, both in pharmaceuticals, but also in cell growth and organ development. And being in a virtually zero gravity environment, can you expand on what the advantages of developing these kind of approaches, pharmaceutical and biological, in a zero gravity environment?
Sure. Again, in the NSPA program, I've had the opportunity to watch a number of projects get funded by NASA, and there are a number of private companies that are now looking at creating microgravity environments in space where you can do manufacturing. A company called Varda, and I think SpaceX Starship will do that. But in space, you can make molecules that you can't make in gravity because gravity basically doesn't allow some of these structures to exist. And then you can make compounds, metallic alloys, and other materials that, again, can't be made on Earth because on Earth, the heavier elements all sink to the bottom of the container as the material solidifies, and they create convection, basically currents inside the material that produces imperfections in the structure. In space, you make perfect crystals that are much larger than can be made on Earth. This is important for optics, but it also has incredible medical applications. Crystallizing pharmaceuticals extends their shelf life for non-refrigerated applications, particularly in areas like sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America where it's hard to get them. You can crystallize really complex molecules in space you can't do on Earth. You can also grow stem cells, Newt, at rates many, many times faster than you can on Earth. So, for instance, if you needed a new liver, we could send up some of your stem cells taken from your blood, differentiate them into liver cells, and grow potentially a organ in space, bring it back to you and reimplant it. When we try to do that on Earth, the growth rates are really slow and the liver turns into a liver pancake because of gravity in the petri dish, basically. So we then can give you a liver that doesn't require immunosuppressant drugs, which are expensive and introduce risk to you as a recipient by reducing your immune system and save, frankly, the government millions and millions of dollars because people who are organ transplant recipients cost a lot of money to maintain now. And we can do it all without having the Chinese kill a Falun Gong member to provide a liver or wait for some poor person to die in a car accident.
So you're really talking about a potential revolution in both pharmaceuticals and in the development of biology by moving it into a zero gravity kind of environment.
If you go to a pharmaceutical plant, and what do you see? You see these big mixing vats. And why are we mixing? Because the chemicals will not interact efficiently because the mass of the chemicals varies and they stratify in the solution. So in space, no problem. Things mix properly.
Isn't one of the challenges that the International Space Station is growing old?
Yes, and it's not, frankly, perfectly designed for anything. It's kind of a jack of all trades of space stations, right? So actually having a lot of people in your manufacturing space station isn't the best idea because they create vibrations and they emit chemicals and they require a lot of energy and maintenance. And of course, having a manufacturing environment going on when you're trying to do space tourism isn't necessarily the best thing. So I think we're going to see a shift, hopefully, to commercial LEO destinations, which NASA is supporting, that will have specialized capabilities. And some of them will eventually be manufacturing stations because, the space station is going to have to go. Right now, the target date is 2030. We believe that we could probably push it to 2035. It's problematic, though, working with the Russians, and the Russian equipment in particular is getting kind of scarily unreliable.
The notion of being able to move, as the Starship will, to be able to move large numbers of people and large amounts of weight into space, it seems to me could be a liberating moment, almost a turning point in how we operate in space. Do you think enough young people realize what kind of careers we may be on the verge of inventing? Because it's a little bit like Silicon Valley around 1970. I mean, space could be right at the edge of takeoff.
It is, Newt, and I think they are beginning to see it. When I speak to my colleagues, either here at Arizona State University or at Purdue or at Imperial College London, where I'm a visiting professor, the space classes are filling up. And the professors have told me, back in the 90s or early 2000s, I couldn't get 12 students into my aerospace engineering class, and now I have 5 sections with 200 students in each of them. They've gotten that message, and space is the hot new place to go. For my own program, I teach executives. So these are pretty senior professional folks, farther along in their career path, but a lot of them want to move into space from other industries, particularly from the tech industry, because they know that it's the hot new ticket. So yeah, that boom is here.
So things are moving in the right direction. Do you think that we're likely to beat the Chinese to the moon?
Wow. When I was on the president's transition team in 2016, we had a diverse group of highly qualified space professionals. Some of them, I would say, were what you call traditional space folks, more aligned with the military-industrial complex sort of organizations. And a couple of us, myself and Charles Miller, were the commercial space guys. And sometimes we didn't agree on all policy things, which I think is healthy for a presidential team. But we did agree on returning to the moon. We understood how important that was, and we really believed nobody could beat us. Now, here we are, almost 8 years later, and frankly, Newt, I am very concerned. The Chinese, again, say what they're going to do, and they do it on schedule, and they've said they're going to be there in 2030. We should have absolutely had boots on the moon this year. That was the plan back in 2016. And it was only 8 years. Guess what? Kennedy announced the Apollo program in 1961, and the boots were on the moon 8 years later. If we can't do today what we did 50 years ago, something's wrong. To our credit, though, our goal is to return sustainably and permanently this time, not just plant a flag, bring back some rocks, and declare victory. I think it's a real race, Newt. And right now, I'd have to say if there isn't a change in administrations, I'd have to probably put my dollars on the Chinese. And that's not to disparage the hardworking people at NASA, including the appointees there who are doing, I think, a pretty good job considering. But there just isn't top-level support for the program there was when you had Trump and Pence there, who were both very focused on delivering America's space goods.
I worked with Vice President Pence in relaunching the Space Council. And I really did think that he and the president really, they got the rhythm. They understood the importance of this, and they really wanted it to happen.
Yeah, he cared enough about it that he showed up as a speaker at the Space Symposium. I had the honor of being the speaker to go on stage after him, which was kind of intimidating. But no, you need that level of top cover. I was at Space Symposium this year, and Vice President Harris sent in a video. And it's nice that she had time to do that, but it is not the same level of commitment. The Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, was at Space Symposium, and he understood space. There were several people in the cabinet level who actually understood space, and that we don't have that right now.
I want to thank you. I think you're one of the pioneers who has had the vision and the consistency and the policy orientation. And if we do end up with freedom in space and with free people doing things, you will be one of the figures in history who helped make this happen. I think really you are a major force in the direction we're going in. And I want to thank you for joining me and remind people that your new book, Red Moon Rising, How America Will Beat China in the Final Frontier, is available on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. I encourage everyone interested in the new space race with China to get a copy and then to call their House and Senate members and get them to do the right thing.
Thank you, Newt. It's been a real honor to be here, and there's nothing I care about more than making sure that America and, frankly, humanity get to the stars.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. Greg Autry. You can get a link to buy his new book, Red Moon Rising, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.